Welcome, dear listener, to this calm journey through medieval life. Tonight, we're stepping into a harder time, a world of backbreaking work, harsh punishments, and daily struggles you won't miss. Forget the castles and knights Hollywood talks about. The truth is, most people wouldn't last a day in those shoes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like if you find this story worth your time, and subscribe if you want more quiet history like this. Now, dim the lights, and let's settle in for tonight's journey. You're waking up before dawn, your muscles already sore from yesterday's work. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and something far worse, the sharp stench of human waste tossed into the streets. This wasn't just a bad morning. It was every morning for a medieval peasant. You'd put in up to 16 hours a day during harvest season, burning over 4,000 calories on strips of land owed to the local lord. No weekends, no sick days, just a cycle of endless labor until your body gave out. And it all started with that first breath at dawn. The smell that greeted you each morning was more than just unpleasant. It was a warning. The air in a medieval town was heavy with the odor of human waste, spoiled food, and whatever else had been tossed from windows overnight. Chamber pots were emptied straight into the street, sometimes with a shouted "Gardyloo" as your only defense. If you weren't quick enough, and people rarely were quick enough, you might get a nasty surprise. The streets themselves were open sewers, collecting everything from household refuse to the runoff from butcher shops and tanneries, all blending into a foul soup underfoot. This wasn't just a city problem. In London, chroniclers called the River Thames a monster of stink. Every kind of waste, human, animal, and industrial, found its way into the water. The river's surface shimmered with filth, and if you lived nearby, the smell settled into your clothes, your hair, and even your food. The same was true for towns across Europe. The stench wasn't just a background detail, it was a real danger. With piles of rotting meat, feces, and spoiled scraps everywhere, diseases like dysentery and typhoid thrived. Every breath you took was a gamble. There were people whose job was to fight back against the filth, gong farmers. Their task was to dig out cesspits and drag the contents outside the city walls. They worked at night, trying to keep up with the endless tide of waste, but no matter how hard they tried, it was never enough. And because the smell stuck to them, they were avoided by everyone else. Their life was spending long nights knee-deep in sewage, no gloves, no boots, just a shovel and a strong stomach. But even if you weren't a gong farmer, you couldn't escape the stink. It followed you through the streets, into your home, and everywhere you went. Public latrines, when you could find one, were little more than a bench with holes over a pit. No privacy, no partitions, just a crowded, stuffy room where everyone did their business together and tried not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper didn't exist. You used whatever was handy: straw, leaves, rags, or moss if you were lucky. If you had money, maybe you got a scrap of wool, but you still weren't getting clean. Bacteria clung to your hands and found its way into your food, your drink, your mouth. Sickness was a way of life. Inside, things weren't much better. Homes were small, dark, and poorly ventilated. Livestock like chickens or pigs lived right alongside you, adding animal waste to the mix. The smell of manure and sweat soaked into the walls and your bedding. If you've ever walked into a barn on a hot day, you've had a taste, but now imagine trying to sleep in that. And that pervasive stench set the stage for an even rougher morning meal. Breakfast was never about enjoyment. It was about getting something in your stomach before the work began. Most mornings you'd find yourself hunched over a bowl of pottage. This wasn't a hearty stew. It was a thin, lumpy soup made from whatever vegetables were left, maybe a few beans, and the odd onion if the season was kind. The same pot simmered day after day, new scraps tossed in as you found them. Sometimes you'd spot a weevil or a bit of dirt, but you ate it anyway. Food was too precious to waste, and hunger was always waiting. Next to the pottage was bread, but don't picture anything soft or golden. Peasant bread was dark, dense, and rough, ground on stone mills that left tiny chips in every bite. The result? A gritty, jaw-breaking loaf that wore down your teeth year after year. People joked about bread that could stop an arrow, but broken teeth were no joke at all. If you still had most of yours by 20, you were luckier than most. There was, of course, another risk. Ergot. This fungus grew on rye, and if it slipped into your bread, you wouldn't notice until strange things started happening. Hallucinations, burning pain, numb limbs. Sometimes whole villages fell into chaos, convinced they were cursed. At times, this even sparked witch trials when entire communities started seeing things that weren't there. One bad loaf could make the whole village sick. But sometimes you didn't even get bread. In years, when the harvest failed, you made do with whatever was left. Acorns, bark ground into flour, anything to fill the emptiness. Meat was a rare treat and came with its own risks. Poach a deer and risk losing a hand. No legal nuance, just swift punishment. Most days, if there was meat at all, it was whatever was left after the Lord's feast. Lungs or intestines in your bowl, boiled down until they were barely recognizable. Dairy was just as uncertain. If your family had a cow or goat, then congratulations. You were one of the wealthy ones and you might get milk, but it spoiled quickly. Cheese was hard and bland, and butter was precious enough to pay rent with. There was no variety, just the same handful of foods, day in and day out. Spring meant a little freshness, winter meant moldy grain and hoping you'd make it to the next season. Spices were a fantasy. Pepper cost more than you'd see in a year, and salt was almost as precious. Preserving food was a daily struggle. Your bread might be stale, your cheese starting to rot, but you ate it anyway. There were no expiration dates, just the hope that you'd get through another meal without getting sick, and every bite you managed was vital. Without it, your body simply couldn't keep up. The work ahead demanded all the energy you could scrape together. But even if you managed to fill your stomach, what you drank could be just as risky. Ale was your daily lifeline. From the time you could hold a cup, you drank it with every meal, around 8 pints a day, sometimes more if it was hot or the work was hard. Even young kids got their share, sipping small ale that was weak, about 1 or 2% alcohol, but still safer than any water you could find. The brewing process, though nobody understood the science, boiled out most of the dangerous stuff lurking in the water. What you ended up with was cloudy, sour, and just strong enough to keep you alive. This wasn't the kind of drink you'd look forward to. Think of it as liquid bread, heavy, filling, and a little gritty. Brewing was usually done by the women in your family, using whatever grain you could spare, barley or oats if you were lucky. No fancy hops yet. Sometimes the ale turned vinegary, but you still drank it. The alternative was worse. Water was for washing. Clothes, animals, maybe your own hands. But not too often, as medieval people believed the dirt on your skin was what kept you healthy. So the less you washed yourself, the better. Wells and streams were full of filth, and everyone knew someone who'd gotten sick from the bad water. Travelers who skipped the brew often fell ill with what locals called the flux, stomach cramps, and worse. When disease swept through, villages switched to ale only, hoping to outlast the outbreak with whatever they could brew. Storage was never easy. Ale kept for a week, maybe 2, before it started to sour. Wooden barrels let in just enough air to make things interesting, so you drank it quickly and hoped the next batch would be better. If you ran out of grain, you ran out of ale, and then you were in real trouble. The wealthy had wine or mead, but most of the time, you just had what you could make at home. A bad batch meant days of thirst or risking the water. Despite all that ale, most people weren't stumbling around drunk. The stuff you drank every day was too weak for that. You'd have to drink a gallon fast to feel much, and nobody had time for hangovers when there was work to do. Still, accidents happened. Kids sneaking festival ale, adults overdoing it at harvest celebrations. But for the most part, calories and safety mattered more than a buzz. The downside was, your body paid for it. Ale filled you up, but it left you bloated, gassy, and tired of the taste. Kids' teeth rotted from constant exposure, but at least they survived. When the ale ran out, or when famine hit and there was no grain, people turned back to the water. And that's when villages emptied out, struck down by disease faster than anyone could bury the dead. Ale kept you alive, but even that constant draft offered little comfort. The real challenge began as soon as the sun crept over the horizon and your workday started, long before you'd had a chance to rest. Every day was shaped by the same routine: work and more work. No one cared if you were sick or tired. The church bell marked the start, and you answered no matter what. There were no weekends, no time off for a cold or a funeral. If you didn't show up, your family went hungry. That was the rule, and it never changed. The cycle of fieldwork was endless. You started with the animals, milking cows, feeding pigs, collecting eggs, then moved straight to the fields. Plowing, planting, and weeding blurred together. You'd drag a wooden plow behind a pair of oxen if you had them, or just your own aching body if you didn't. After hours of turning heavy soil, you'd stoop to drop seeds by hand, careful not to waste a single one. Then, on your knees in the mud, you'd pull weeds under the sun, hoping your back wouldn't give out before the day was done. Medieval records show farm laborers burned over 4,000 calories daily just to keep going. If the ground was rocky or the weather turned, you just kept working. There was no other choice. Harvest season was its own kind of misery. 16-hour days weren't rare, they were expected. You swung a sickle until your arms went numb, racing to gather every last stalk before the weather ruined it all. There was no such thing as overtime. If you collapsed, someone else took your spot, and you just hoped you'd be able to stand again the next morning. But your responsibilities didn't end in the fields. Evenings were for mending tools, grinding grain, or spinning wool. Your sister and mother boiled water and spun thread, while you and your siblings hauled firewood or scared birds from the crops. Everyone worked, even the youngest. If you could walk, you could work. Sleep was a luxury, often interrupted by the need to check on animals or chase a stray pig before it destroyed the neighbor's garden. Miss a chore, and you'd pay for it, sometimes literally. On top of all this, you owed your lord days of labor, fixing fences, digging ditches, hauling stones for whatever project he dreamed up. Usually, it was 3 days a week, but that could double during planting or harvest. If you refused, you lost your strip of land, and with it, your only hope of survival. The feudal system made sure you never forgot who was in charge. Each season brought its own set of problems. Spring meant cold rain and mud. Summer brought sunburn and biting insects. Autumn was a frantic rush to bring in the crops before the cold set in. Winter was endless, chopping and hauling, hands cracked and raw from the cold. There were no holidays, no retirement. You worked until your body couldn't take it anymore. Skeletons from the time show twisted spines, worn joints, and old injuries that never healed. And when your body finally screamed for rest, another kind of ordeal awaited you. The rules in your village weren't just strict, they were brutal. Even a small mistake, like taking a loaf of bread, could cost you far more than a meal. Justice in medieval times was something you felt in your bones. The legal system was harsh, unpredictable, and different in every town. There were no clear rules, just a patchwork of local customs and the whims of whoever held power. What might get you a warning in one village could mean losing a limb in the next. In medieval England, over 200 different crimes could get you hanged. Some were obvious, murder, arson, or theft, but others were almost laughably small. Cut down a tree in the king's forest, or steal something worth more than 12 pence, and you could find yourself at the end of a rope. The list of capital offenses was long, and it grew longer every year. The point wasn't to be fair. It was to keep people in line and protect the interests of the powerful. If you were caught stealing, the punishment was brutal. A common sentence for theft was having your hand chopped off. No trial as you'd imagine it, no second chances, just the cold certainty of the axe. There was no anesthesia, no clean blade, and no real hope of recovery. If infection set in, you might last a few days. If you survived, you'd never work the fields again, and begging was usually your only option. Many didn't make it that far. Punishments didn't stop at losing a hand. Mutilations were common, branding, whipping, or having an ear sliced off. These marks were permanent, a warning to everyone who saw you. For women and men alike, the consequences were severe, with little sympathy for circumstance. There was no leniency for hunger or desperation. Not all sentences involved blood. Sometimes you'd be locked in the stocks, your ankles and wrists trapped in wood, stuck in the village square while people hurled rotten fruit or worse. Hours in the sun left your skin burning and your dignity gone. The pillory was similar. Your head and hands locked in place, exposed to whatever the crowd could throw. Some people didn't survive, not from the punishment itself, but from the humiliation, dehydration, or the injuries that followed. The system was never about fairness. Nobles who broke the law often paid a fine and went home. But if you were poor, you took the full force of the punishment. Children weren't spared either. A 12-year-old caught stealing could be hanged, with no consideration for age or reason. The law existed to protect property, not people, and certainly not peasants. Worst of all, the effects lasted forever. Lose a hand, and you were marked for life. A branded face couldn't be hidden. A whipping left scars that never faded. Surviving your punishment didn't mean you got to start over. Most ex-criminals were driven out of town or forced into begging. Some turned to banditry, starting the whole cycle again. Punishments weren't meant to rehabilitate, they were meant to terrify, and they did. And if you ever found yourself accused, the real nightmare began when it was time to prove your innocence. In the Middle Ages, being accused of a crime meant your fate rested on superstition and spectacle, not evidence. Trials by ordeal were the ultimate test, where guilt or innocence depended on whether you could survive a ritual designed to break you. The logic was simple. If you were truly innocent, surely God would step in to protect you. If not, well, you'd pay the price. The ordeal of hot iron was the favorite. You'd be marched into the church, handed a red-hot iron bar, and told to carry it 9 feet while everyone watched. Priests would chant, and the whole village would stare. Afterward, your hand was wrapped up and you were sent home to wait. 3 days later, the priest would unwrap the bandages and check the wound. If your burns looked clean, no pus, no infection, you were declared innocent. But in a world without soap or antibiotics, burns almost always festered. The odds were never in your favor. Most people didn't even make it to the verdict. Infection could kill you before the priest gave his blessing. Then there was the ordeal by water. They'd tie your wrists and ankles and toss you into a river or pond. The idea was that water, being pure, would reject the guilty. If you floated, you were guilty, pulled out, and usually executed. If you sank, you were innocent, assuming someone fished you out before you drowned. Most people floated out of sheer panic, but that didn't matter. The crowd believed what they wanted to believe, and the water rarely lied in your favor. There were other, less common ordeals. Sometimes you'd be forced to eat a cursed piece of bread. If you choked, you were guilty. Most people didn't even get that far. The threat of the iron or water was usually enough to make someone confess, guilty or not. Trials by combat were technically an option, but unless you were rich enough to afford weapons and armor, you'd never see that arena. For peasants, it was iron, water, or nothing. Even church leaders eventually decried these methods, but out in the villages, the fear lingered for generations. The ordeal wasn't just about finding the truth, it was about making sure everyone else saw what happened to those who stepped out of line. One look at a neighbor's ruined hand, or at someone coughing up river water, and you'd think twice before breaking any rule. People dreaded the ordeal more than the punishment itself. Some went to the gallows willingly, just to avoid the days of agony and the chance of dying slowly from infection. Others ran, choosing life as an outlaw over a trial they knew they couldn't win. Sometimes, you'd admit to a lesser crime just to avoid the iron, even if you hadn't done anything wrong. Justice was less about truth and more about control. Each ordeal was a reminder that authority cared more about order than fairness. And if you somehow survived the trial, you'd carry the scars for life, physical proof that you'd been dragged through the system and lived to tell about it. But surviving the law was only half the battle. Getting sick in medieval times wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be a death sentence. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a gamble you rarely won. If you got sick, the first thing you'd hear was talk of bad air or your humors being out of balance. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were supposed to explain every cough, fever, or ache you had. Doctors and healers didn't know about germs, so most treatments were blind guesses. The result? A simple cold could spiral into something deadly, and the cures were often worse than the illness. Bloodletting was the go-to answer for almost anything. Fever, out comes the knife, or if you were lucky, a few dozen leeches. Some doctors even recommended up to 70 leeches at a time, convinced this would suck out the sickness. You'd lie there, weak and dizzy, while the doctor nodded in approval. All that blood loss just left you more vulnerable, and the dirty blades or hands meant infection was almost guaranteed. But since no one understood why people got sicker, the practice stuck around for centuries. If you had a rash or something more serious, like syphilis, you might get a prescription for mercury. Mercury was so toxic it often killed patients as surely as the disease. Doctors thought the worse you felt, the better the medicine was working. Shaking, drooling, and losing your teeth were all just signs the treatment was doing its job. Recovery was rare. Most people died from the cure, not the sickness. Surgery and dentistry were their own brand of nightmare. No anesthesia, no clean tools, just a strong drink or a blow to the head to dull the pain. If you broke a bone, the fix was to yank it straight and hope for the best. Amputation meant biting down on leather while someone sawed through your limb. Infection set in fast, and if you survived the shock, you'd probably lose your life to sepsis. Toothaches were handled by the local barber, who'd yank out rotten teeth with pliers he'd just used to trim someone's beard. No numbing, no cleaning, just pain. Some people let their teeth rot out rather than face the agony, and tooth pain could be a death sentence. Childbirth was one of the riskiest things you could go through. Midwives did what they could, but without ways to stop bleeding or fight infection, 1 in 3 women died giving birth. If the baby survived, the odds weren't great. About 30% of children died before reaching the age of 5. Royalty and peasants alike faced the same risks. There were no guarantees, only hope and a lot of prayers. Home remedies didn't offer much comfort. People tried everything from crushed pearls for stomach aches to wearing dead toads for nosebleeds. Herbal potions, prayers, and superstition filled the gap left by real medicine. Sometimes you got lucky and the illness passed. More often, you just got sicker. Hospitals were places you went when you had nowhere else to go. Monks ran them, but they weren't trained doctors. Patients shared beds, diseases, and whatever herbal concoctions were on hand. Most people left sicker than they arrived, if they left at all. It was a world where simple medicine could kill as easily as cure. Childhood in the Middle Ages was less about innocence and more about survival from the very start. If you were born, you'd already dodged one of the biggest risks, childbirth itself. But what came next wasn't much gentler. Disease, hunger, and accidents waited for you at every turn, and nobody got a break just for being young. Babies depended entirely on their mothers. If she couldn't nurse, your options were slim: animal milk, or maybe bread mashed up and soaked in ale. Not exactly a recipe for thriving. Swaddling was meant to keep babies safe, but being wrapped tight for months sometimes left legs twisted or hips deformed. For cradle cap, well-meaning parents might rub it with urine and hope for the best. And when you cried with colic, the answer could be anything from herbal charms to a handful of dead bats sewn into a pouch. Nutrition was a constant struggle. Even the rich rarely saw fresh fruit or vegetables. Doctors claimed they were dangerous. Most meals were bread and ale, day after day, so your teeth rotted early and your bones grew soft. Skeletons dug up from medieval graveyards show kids with stunted growth, curved limbs, and misshapen skulls. If you made it to 7, you'd already outlived many of your peers, but your body would probably show the cost. Bent spines from hauling water, swollen joints from chores that started as soon as you could walk. Parents cared about their children, but love couldn't stop the fevers, coughs, or rashes that swept through villages. A cold could turn deadly fast, and measles or summer diarrhea, outbreaks that hit when food and water spoiled in the heat, could wipe out families. Plague years were even worse, with the youngest dying first. Graveyards filled with tiny coffins, and sometimes desperate families buried babies under doorsteps or by the hearth because the church refused them proper graves. Education was a luxury. Peasant children learned to work, not read. By the age of 3, you'd help with chores, and by 7, you'd be in the fields or apprenticed to a craftsman, working long hours for little more than a meal and a place to sleep. Nobles sometimes got tutors, but even they spent more time learning to manage estates than reading books. Apprenticeships meant years of hard labor, often with beatings as part of the training. Notices for runaway apprentices sounded more like lost livestock than missing children. Games existed, but they were rare and often rough. Most of the time, you snatched moments of play between chores, rolling hoops, chasing each other, or making toys out of scraps. A few lucky children had dolls or carved animals, and the rare church feast might bring a treat or a glimpse of a traveling performer. But few youngsters knew free play. Most learned to labor as soon as they could stand. Parents tried to shield themselves from grief, sometimes listing lost children in the family Bible like they were tallying debts. Prayers for a sick child were practical. God, if this child is meant to live, let it survive this fever. When loss was so common, emotional restraint became a survival tool. Still, traces of affection show up in the smallest details: patched shoes, a song at bedtime, a tiny pot shaped just for a child's hands. And as hard as life was for children, It got even harder when the threat of war arrived on your doorstep. War in the Middle Ages didn't stay on distant battlefields or in stories about knights. It showed up on your doorstep, sometimes with barely a warning. When armies marched through your village, they didn't bring their own food or supplies. They took yours. Soldiers raided your grain stores, slaughtered your livestock, and ate through your winter rations in a single night. These weren't outlaws. This was how armies survived. Commanders expected their troops to live off the land, and that meant stripping you bare so the army could keep moving. If you thought you could hide in your home or keep your head down, think again. Even friendly soldiers from your own kingdom would requisition whatever they needed, promising payment that never showed up. Refusing meant trouble, sometimes a beating, sometimes worse. The only rule was that the army came first. You and your family came a distant second. Sieges were even worse. When a castle or walled town nearby was surrounded, you got caught in the middle. The attacking army burned fields and orchards to starve out defenders, and whatever food you had left was fair game for both sides. Sometimes the defenders would raid your stores before the enemy could. During the 885 to 886 siege of Paris, things got so desperate that people ate rats, cats, and even fellow humans. If your village was in the path of a siege, you might try to run, but there was nowhere safe. Other villages were just as vulnerable, and the forests offered little shelter, sometimes more danger than safety. Disease followed every army. Thousands of men camping near your fields meant latrine pits, rotting food, and rivers choked with waste. Disease claimed more lives than steel ever did. Soldiers brought fevers with them, and soon your whole village was coughing and shivering. There were no doctors, no real medicine, just old remedies and the hope that you'd be lucky this time. Sometimes, half an army would die before even seeing battle, but the villagers nearby always paid the price first. War changed everything around you. Vineyards that took generations to grow could be torched in an afternoon. Orchards were chopped down for firewood or siege engines. Salt poured onto fields, ruined the soil for years. Wells and drainage ditches filled with bodies or waste, poisoning the water for everyone left behind. Some villages never recovered at all. Archaeologists still find deserted medieval villages, places where people just vanished after one raid too many. Children suffered the most. Malnutrition made them easy prey for every sickness armies carried. Orphans became beggars, servants, or were pressed into service as child soldiers. Girls were at risk of being taken as camp followers, a polite word for something far uglier. For families that survived, the scars of war lasted longer than any battle. Most peasants had no idea who was fighting or why. Lords changed sides, new taxes showed up, and you paid for wars you never chose. Tax collectors always followed the armies, demanding more from people who already had nothing left. If you couldn't pay, the punishments were swift and harsh. Sometimes villages fought back, ambushing soldiers, hiding food, or sabotaging supplies. But most of the time, you endured. Armies eventually moved on, leaving you to pick through ruins and try to start over. And in the end, war swept through peasant lives without warning, leaving scars deeper than any battlefield. But even when the armies left, the struggle never really ended. Life just slipped back into its old, grinding pattern, an endless loop of work, hunger, and exhaustion that never seemed to let up. For a medieval peasant, routine was more like a sentence than a comfort. The cycle never paused. From the moment you could stand, your life was measured by the seasons and the demands of the land and lord. Every year spun through the same motions: plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, chopping wood, patching roofs, hauling water. each task relentless, each day blending into the next. There was no finish line, no reward at the end of the week, just the certainty that tomorrow would bring the same grind. Spring wasn't about renewal. It was about thawing out your hands enough to push a plow through frozen mud. Summer meant sweating under a relentless sun, dodging biting insects, and hoping your crops would survive storms or drought. Autumn was a race to gather every last stalk before the cold set in, and winter brought the threat of hunger as food stores ran low and you chopped wood with numb fingers. Each season had its own way of wearing you down, and there was no real break, only a different flavor of hard. Physical labor consumed you, but your daily meals rarely matched what your body needed. Malnutrition set in, making you weaker, which made the work even harder, a downward spiral you couldn't escape. Bones found from the era show spines bent from years of bending and lifting, joints worn smooth, and breaks that never healed straight. You worked through pain, illness, and injury because stopping meant going without. Disease was always lurking. It didn't take a plague, just a fever, a cut, or a cough could be enough to push your body over the edge. With no real medicine, even a small wound could turn deadly. If you made it past childhood, you could expect to live somewhere between 30 and 40 years, and most of that time was spent working. There was no plan for old age. When you couldn't keep up, you relied on your children, if you had any left, to feed you. If not, you begged or went hungry. Rest was never truly restful. You shared a cramped, one-room hut with your family and whatever livestock you could keep from being stolen. The air stank of animals and sweat, the straw mattress was alive with fleas, and sleep was short and uneasy before the church bell called you back to the fields. Even your dreams rarely offered escape, just more of the same endless work. The system made sure nothing changed. The Lord demanded his share of your labor, 3 days a week, sometimes more during harvest. Whatever time you had left went to your own tiny plot, and taxes claimed a chunk of what little you managed to grow. Miss a payment, and the bailiff would take whatever he could carry. Upward mobility wasn't even a fantasy. Your family had always been peasants, and your children would be too. Religion offered some comfort, promising reward in the next life since this one had little to give. But the church came with its own demands: tithes, feast day labor, and the expectation that you'd still show up, even when you had nothing left. Sundays might be called a day of rest, but the animals didn't care, and fields couldn't wait. Any pause in the cycle, whether from illness, injury, or storm, wasn't a break, just a new burden. Work piled up, food ran short, and the anxiety of falling behind weighed on everyone. Winter, instead of a time to recover, became the season of hunger, when you watched your family's ribs show through their skin and hoped spring would come soon enough. Many saw the final rest as the only release from endless toil. Graves were shallow, markers were rare, and your name faded from memory almost as soon as you were gone. To the Lord, you were just a number in a ledger. Your entire life was a brief, hard interval between birth and oblivion, and that, above all, is why you wouldn't last a single day. Stepping back from that world, it's clear just how far we've come. The daily reality for a medieval peasant, constant labor, hunger, and the looming threat of illness makes modern problems seem smaller by comparison. So if you find yourself annoyed by a cold shower or a slow internet connection, remember, at least you're not waking up to a day of fieldwork with little food and no real rest. Now drift back to your modern comforts and let this world of hard labor fade away.